Owen Thatcher stood at the foot of the winding gravel path, his eyes fixed upon the looming silhouette of Hollowspire House. The mansion, a grotesque amalgamation of Gothic and Victorian architecture, seemed to claw at the gray sky with its twisted spires and gnarled chimneys. A chill wind whispered through the surrounding forest, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and the faint, disquieting sensation that something was terribly amiss. As a struggling young architect, Owen had jumped at the chance to renovate this abandoned relic. The generous commission promised to breathe new life into his faltering career, and the challenge of restoring such a unique structure thrilled him. Yet, as he gazed upon the house's weather-beaten facade, a sense of unease crept along his spine like icy fingers. "Pull yourself together," he muttered, adjusting the strap of his leather satchel. "It's just an old house." With a deep breath, Owen started up the path. Each step crunched loudly in the oppressive silence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching his approach. The overgrown gardens flanking the path seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision, but when he turned to look directly at them, they were perfectly still. As he neared the house, its true scale became apparent. Hollowspire loomed impossibly large, its windows like dark, lidless eyes staring down at him. The front door, a massive oak slab adorned with intricate carvings of twisting vines and leering faces, stood slightly ajar. Owen hesitated, his hand hovering over the tarnished brass knocker. A voice in the back of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But the rational part of his brain, the part that desperately needed this job, pushed the feeling aside. He grasped the knocker and brought it down 3 times, the sound echoing through the house like the tolling of a funeral bell. No answer came. Steeling himself, Owen pushed the door open and stepped inside. The foyer was cavernous, its high ceiling lost in shadow. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows. The air was thick and stale, carrying the musty odor of long abandonment. "Hello?" Owen called out, his voice swallowed by the vastness of the space. "Mr. Blackwood? It's Owen Thatcher, the architect." Silence was his only reply. Owen frowned. His client, Ezra Blackwood, a reclusive millionaire with an interest in architectural oddities, had insisted on meeting him at the house to discuss the renovation plans. But there was no sign of the man, nor any indication that anyone had been here in years. Shrugging off his unease, Owen decided to begin his preliminary survey of the house. He pulled out his notebook and a pencil, then made his way deeper into Hollowspire's labyrinthine interior. The layout of the house immediately struck Owen as peculiar. Hallways branched off at odd angles, leading to rooms that seemed to defy the laws of geometry. He found himself in a circular chamber with 7 doors, each identical and unmarked. Choosing one at random, he emerged into a narrow corridor that spiraled upward like the inside of a nautilus shell. As he explored, Owen's initial excitement began to give way to a growing sense of disquiet. The house seemed to resist his attempts to map it, with rooms that appeared larger on the inside than their exterior dimensions should allow, and staircases that led to impossible places. More than once, he found himself stepping through a doorway, only to emerge back in a room he had just left, as though the house was playfully mocking his efforts to understand it. Hours passed, though Owen's watch seemed to have stopped working the moment he entered Hollowspire. The light outside the windows remained a constant, dreary gray, giving no indication of the passage of time. His meticulous notes became a jumble of contradictory measurements and nonsensical floor plans that looked more like the scrawlings of a madman than the work of a trained architect. It was during his exploration of the house's east wing that Owen first heard the whispers. At first, he dismissed them as the creaking of old wood or the wind finding its way through cracks in the walls. But as he paused to listen, the sounds coalesced into something unmistakably like hushed voices, too faint to make out words but carrying a tone of urgent, fearful warning. "Is someone there?" Owen called out, his voice cracking slightly. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving him in oppressive silence once more. Shaken, Owen decided it was time to leave. He had gathered enough information for one day, and the growing shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. But as he turned to retrace his steps, he realized with a sinking feeling that he had no idea how to get back to the foyer. Every corridor looked the same, every room a mirror image of the last. Owen's pace quickened as panic began to set in. He threw open doors at random, finding himself in a dizzying succession of chambers that seemed to defy logic. A library with books whose titles shifted and changed as he tried to read them. A dining room where the elongated table stretched into infinity. A nursery filled with dolls whose glassy eyes followed his every move. Hours seemed to pass as Owen wandered the twisting passages of Hollowspire, his calls for help echoing mockingly back at him. The house seemed to be toying with him, leading him in circles, always keeping the exit just out of reach. His rational mind struggled to make sense of the impossible architecture, but with each passing moment his grip on reality began to slip. It was well past midnight when Owen finally stumbled back into the foyer, though he had no memory of how he had found his way there. The front door stood before him, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness of the house. With trembling hands, he grasped the handle and pulled. The door didn't budge. Owen pulled harder, then pushed, then threw his entire weight against the unyielding oak. But it was as if the door had become one with the wall, a cruel illusion of escape. Panic overwhelmed him, and he began to pound on the door, screaming for help that he knew would never come. Behind him, the house seemed to come alive. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled the air with their urgent, terrified warnings. The walls began to pulse and writhe, the very structure of the house shifting and changing around him. Owen turned, his back pressed against the door, and watched in horror as the foyer stretched and distorted, the ceiling rising impossibly high while the walls closed in around him. As his mind teetered on the brink of madness, Owen's gaze was drawn to a mirror hanging on the far wall. In its reflection, he saw not himself, but the face of a man he didn't recognize, gaunt, wild-eyed, with a long, unkempt beard. The man's lips moved, forming words that Owen could barely hear over the din of whispers. "The house at dreams." With a strangled cry, Owen collapsed to the floor, his consciousness slipping away as the house continued its impossible transformations around him. His last thought before darkness claimed him was a chilling realization. Hollowspire House was not just a building. It was alive, and it had no intention of letting him leave. When Owen awoke, he found himself lying on a dusty four-poster bed in a room he didn't recognize. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that the events of the previous day had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare, but as he sat up, a wave of dizziness washing over him, Owen knew that his ordeal was far from over. The room seemed to pulse and breathe around him, the wallpaper patterns shifting and writhing when he wasn't looking directly at them. And there, on the bedside table, lay his notebook, open to a page filled with frantic scribblings he had no memory of making. With trembling hands, Owen picked up the notebook and began to read. The words, written in his own hand but in a style he barely recognized, told a story that chilled him to his very core. It spoke of the true nature of Hollowspire House, of the malevolent entity that dwelled within its walls, and of the fate that awaited all who dared to enter. As he read, Owen felt the last vestiges of his rational mind begin to crumble. The house had chosen him, just as it had chosen so many others before. And now, trapped within its ever-shifting corridors and impossible rooms, he knew that his struggle to maintain his sanity and to find a way to escape had only just begun. Outside the window, a cold gray dawn broke over the twisted spires of Hollowspire House. And deep within its walls, the house continued to dream, weaving nightmares for its newest prisoner. The days that followed Owen's awakening in that dusty bedroom blurred together in a nightmarish haze. Time seemed to lose all meaning within the twisted confines of Hollowspire House. The sun would rise and set at irregular intervals, sometimes plunging the house into darkness for what felt like days, only to have brilliant, searing light flood through the windows moments later. Owen's attempts to map the house's layout grew increasingly futile. Rooms would appear and disappear at will, corridors would stretch endlessly before abruptly terminating in blank walls, and staircases would lead to entirely different parts of the house with each ascent or descent. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp and bend within Hollowspire's walls, as if the house was constructed not of wood and stone, but of the malleable stuff of dreams, or nightmares. It was during one of his endless wanderings through the shifting labyrinth that Owen stumbled upon the library. Unlike the rest of the house, this room remained constant, a fixed point in the swirling chaos of Hollowspire. The circular chamber was lined floor to ceiling with shelves, each crammed with ancient tomes bound in cracked leather and materials Owen couldn't identify. A massive oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in stacks of yellowed papers and arcane instru. Drawn by an irresistible curiosity, Owen approached the table. Among the papers, he found architectural drawings that seemed to predate his own ill-fated attempts to map the house. The plans were a maddening jumble of impossible geometries and non-Euclidean shapes, annotated with scrawled notes in a spidery hand. As Owen pored over the drawings, he began to realize that they weren't just plans for Hollowspire, they were a blueprint for something far more sinister. The original architect, a man named Ezekiel Blackwood, had designed the house not as a dwelling but as a trap. The twisting corridors, the shifting rooms, the very instability of the structure itself, all of it was intentional, created to contain something that defied human comprehension. But as Owen read further, his blood ran cold. Blackwood hadn't just built a cage. He had opened a door to something that should never have been unleashed. In his feverish notes, Blackwood wrote of ancient entities that existed beyond the veil of human perception, vast and unknowable beings that slumbered in the spaces between realities. He believed that by manipulating the physical laws of our world through architecture, he could create a space where these entities could manifest. Hollowspire was to be his magnum opus, a living conduit between our world and the realms beyond. But something had gone terribly wrong. The entity Blackwood had sought to summon and study had proven far more powerful and malevolent than he had anticipated. It had merged with the very structure of the house, turning Hollowspire into a sentient, hungry thing that fed on the minds and souls of those who entered. As Owen absorbed this terrifying knowledge, he became aware of a presence in the room with him. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on him with an almost physical weight. The shadows in the corners of the library seemed to deepen and writhe, taking on shapes that his mind refused to process. And then he heard it, a voice that wasn't a voice, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his mind. "Architect," it whispered, the word carrying with it an eternity of malice and hunger. "You who would shape reality to your will, do you see now the true nature of creation?" Owen stumbled back from the table, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice laughed, a sound like the grinding of tectonic plates, and suddenly the room was plunged into darkness. When light returned a moment later, Owen found himself not in the library, but in a vast cavernous space that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The walls, floor and ceiling, if such terms could even apply to this impossible place, were a shifting mass of geometric patterns and fractals that hurt the eye to look upon. Staircases spiraled in impossible directions, doors hung suspended in midair, and windows looked out onto vistas of alien worlds and terrifying voids. "This is the true face of Hollowspire," the voice intoned, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A reflection of the spaces between realities, where thought becomes form and madness is the only sane response. Owen felt his mind beginning to fracture under the weight of what he was witnessing. The logic and reason that had been the foundation of his life as an architect crumbled in the face of this impossible architecture. He wanted to scream, to close his eyes and wake up from this nightmare. But he knew with a dreadful certainty that there would be no waking up. As he stood there, paralyzed by terror and awe, Owen became aware of other presences in this vast space. Ghostly figures flitted at the edges of his vision, previous victims of the house perhaps, or echoes of those who had been consumed by its hunger. Among them, he thought he recognized the gaunt face of the man he had seen in the mirror that first night, his eyes now vacant and lost. The entity that was Hollowspire seemed to take pleasure in Owen's growing madness. It bombarded him with visions of impossible geometries, of realities where the laws of physics were mere suggestions, of vast cosmic entities whose very existence threatened to unravel the fabric of his mind. Through it all, Owen clung desperately to the last shreds of his sanity, trying to find some anchor in the swirling chaos. It was then, in his darkest moment, that Owen had an epiphany. If Hollowspire was indeed a structure shaped by thought and will, then perhaps he, as an architect, had the power to influence it. With every ounce of mental strength he possessed, Owen began to visualize the house as he wanted it to be. Solid, stable, bound by the laws of physics he understood. At first nothing seemed to change, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the chaotic space around him began to stabilize. The shifting patterns slowed, the impossible geometries began to resolve themselves into more recognizable forms. The entity that controlled Hollowspire raged against this intrusion, assaulting Owen's mind with renewed vigor, but he held firm to his vision. Sweat poured down Owen's face as he struggled to maintain his concentration. He could feel the house fighting back, trying to reassert its dominance over reality. But for the first time since he had entered Hollowspire, Owen felt a glimmer of hope. If he could just hold on, just keep pushing, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the impossible space shattered. Owen found himself once again in the foyer of Hollowspire, the house around him groaning and creaking as if in pain. The front door stood before him, and this time, when he grasped the handle, it turned. Sunlight, real sunlight, streamed in as Owen threw the door open. He stumbled out onto the overgrown lawn, gulping in great breaths of fresh air. Behind him, Hollowspire loomed, its windows dark and malevolent, but for the moment, quiescent. As the adrenaline began to fade, Owen realized that his ordeal was far from over. He had won a battle, but the war was far from finished. Hollowspire still stood, and within its walls, the entity that had claimed so many lives still waited, hungry and patient. Owen knew he couldn't simply walk away. The house would find other victims, other minds to devour. And deep down, he knew that a part of him would always be connected to Hollowspire, bound by the knowledge he had gained and the horrors he had witnessed. With trembling hands, Owen reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. By some miracle, it still worked. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving the looming facade of Hollowspire. "Professor Armitage?" he said when the call connected. "This is Owen Thatcher. I need your help. There's something you need to see." As Owen began to explain the situation, he felt a chill run down his spine. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw a face in one of Hollowspire's upper windows, a face that smiled with too many teeth. The battle for Hollowspire House, and perhaps for reality itself, had only just begun. The arrival of Professor Armitage and his team from Miskatonic University brought a semblance of order to the chaos surrounding Hollowspire House. The professor, a wizened man with piercing blue eyes that hinted at knowledge beyond mortal ken, had listened to Owen's frantic tale with a gravity that both validated and terrified the young architect. "You've stumbled upon something far greater and more terrible than you could have imagined, Mr. Thatcher," Armitage had said, his voice low and grave. "But you've also shown a remarkable resilience of mind. We may yet have a chance to contain this abomination." In the days that followed, Hollowspire became a hive of activity. Armitage's team, an eclectic mix of scholars, occultists, and hardened investigators, swarmed over the property, setting up arcane equipment and poring over the eldritch tomes Owen had discovered in the library. Owen found himself thrust into the role of guide and advisor, his newfound connection to the house proving invaluable as they navigated its treacherous interior. The entity within Hollowspire seemed to have retreated, sullen and watchful, in the face of this invasion. But its presence could still be felt, a malevolent pressure that bore down on their minds, testing for weaknesses, probing for a way to reassert its dominance. It was during one of their expeditions into the house's deeper recesses that disaster struck. Dr. Elizabeth Marsh, a brilliant mathematician specializing in non-Euclidean geometries, had been attempting to map one of the more unstable areas of Hollowspire. One moment she was there scribbling furiously in her notebook, the next she was gone, swallowed by a sudden shift in the house's architecture. The team's frantic efforts to locate her proved futile. It was as if the house had erased her from existence, leaving not a trace behind. The loss hit Owen hard, reigniting the terror and hopelessness he had felt during his own ordeal. That night, as the team regrouped in their makeshift base camp on the grounds of Hollowspire, Owen found himself drawn back to the house. Despite the protests of his colleagues, he knew he had to go in alone. Something was calling to him, a faint whisper at the edge of his consciousness that promised answers. As Owen crossed the threshold, He felt the house come alive around him. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an eldritch energy that made his skin crawl. The walls seemed to pulse with a slow, steady rhythm, like the beating of some monstrous heart. "I know you're here," Owen called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. "Show yourself." The response came not in words, but in a sudden, violent shifting of reality. The world around Owen twisted and warped, colors bleeding into one another, surfaces rippling like water. When the vertigo subsided, he found himself in a vast, circular chamber he had never seen before. The walls of the room were lined with mirrors, each reflecting a different impossible vista. Alien landscapes, cosmic voids, realities where the very concepts of space and time seemed to break down. And there, in the center of it all, stood a figure that both was and wasn't Ezekiel Blackwood, the house's original architect. "You've come far, Owen Thatcher," the figure spoke, its voice a discordant chorus of whispers. "Farther than any who came before. But do you understand what it is you face?" As the entity spoke, its form shifted and changed, sometimes appearing as Blackwood, sometimes as a writhing mass of geometric shapes, and sometimes as something so alien that Owen's mind refused to process it. "You're the thing Blackwood summoned," Owen said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "The entity he tried to trap within Hollowspire." The figure laughed, a sound that sent ripples of distortion through the very fabric of reality. "Trapped? No, foolish architect. Blackwood didn't trap me. He freed me. This house, this magnificent creation of human ingenuity and madness, is the perfect conduit between your world and the spaces beyond. Through it I have tasted the minds of countless humans, savored their fear, their awe, their delicious descent into madness." As the entity spoke, Owen became aware of other presences in the room. Ghostly figures began to materialize, the lost souls of Hollowspire's previous victims. Among them, he saw Dr. Marsh, her eyes wide and vacant, her form already beginning to lose cohesion. "You see now the fate that awaits you," the entity continued. "To be consumed, to become one with Hollowspire, to dream the dreams of madness for all eternity." But as terror threatened to overwhelm him, Owen felt something else stirring within him, a fierce determination born of all he had endured. He thought of the glimpse of hope he had felt when he had briefly wrested control from the house, of Professor Armitage's faith in him, of all those who had fallen victim to this cosmic horror. "No," Owen said, his voice growing stronger. "I won't let you take anyone else. This ends now." Drawing upon every ounce of will and every shred of architectural knowledge he possessed, Owen began to focus his mind. He visualized Hollowspire not as the nightmare labyrinth it had become, but as it should be, a structure bound by the laws of physics and geometry that he understood. The entity howled in rage, assaulting Owen's mind with visions of cosmic terror and impossible realities. But Owen stood firm, grounding himself in the solid principles of his craft. In his mind's eye, he began to deconstruct Hollowspire, breaking it down to its component parts, reimagining it as a structure that could contain and neutralize the eldritch energies that powered it. As Owen's vision took shape, the world around him began to change. The mirrors cracked and shattered, the impossible vistas they contained collapsing in on themselves. The ghostly figures of the house's victims began to fade, their faces showing a mix of relief and gratitude as they dissolved into motes of light. The entity that had been Ezekiel Blackwood writhed and twisted, its form blurring as it fought against the new reality Owen was imposing. "You cannot unmake me!" it shrieked, its voice shaking the very foundations of the house. "I am eternal. I am infinite." But Owen could feel the tide turning. With each passing moment, Hollowspire bent further to his will, its impossible geometries resolving into more mundane forms. The entity's struggles grew weaker, its influence waning as the house that had been its conduit and prison began to change. With a final, titanic effort, Owen brought his vision into reality. There was a sound like the universe itself tearing apart, a blinding flash of light, and then silence. Owen found himself standing in the foyer of Hollowspire, but it was a Hollowspire transformed. Gone were the twisted corridors and impossible rooms. In their place stood a house that, while still grand and imposing, was now firmly rooted in the physical laws of our reality. As Owen stumbled out onto the lawn, He was met by Professor Armitage and his team. Their faces showed a mix of awe and concern as Owen recounted what had transpired within the house. "You've done something remarkable, Mr. Thatcher," Armitage said, his voice filled with wonder. "You've not only contained the entity, but you've fundamentally altered the nature of Hollowspire itself. It's no longer a conduit to other realities, but a barrier, a seal that will keep that thing locked away." In the days that followed, as the team worked to secure Hollowspire and ensure the entity remained trapped, Owen found himself grappling with the enormity of what he had experienced. He knew that he would never be the same, that the knowledge he had gained of realities beyond our own would forever color his perception of the world, but he also felt a sense of purpose that he had never known before. Hollowspire House still stood, and while it no longer posed the same threat it once had, Owen knew that there would always be other dangers lurking in the spaces between realities. His experience had given him a unique perspective, a way to combat cosmic horrors through the power of architecture and human will. As he stood before Hollowspire one last time, preparing to leave it in the capable hands of Armitage and his team, Owen felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Fear, yes, and a lingering sense of the cosmic terror he had faced, but also hope and a steely determination. For Owen Thatcher knew that while there would always be houses that dream, there would also be those with the knowledge and will to ensure that such dreams did not become humanity's nightmare.